morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee, but also the companies Teramo and Fresenius Kabi for inviting me over. It's a real pleasure to be here. It was a long trip, and for those who don't know where Belgium is, because it's an extremely small country, I will give you a quick overview. We are actually located in Europe. For those who forget that it's also still existing, we are a very small country. You can see it. You need the magnifying glasses to find it. And if you look at it, we are famous for a lot of good things in life. One of them is Belgian chocolate. The other one, for those who like it, we have 600 different beers. Come over and join them. They are really very tasty. And of course, we are hosting the European Union in our Brussels capital. Where are we located? We are located between Brussels and the coast, so we have a relatively nice climate, not comparable to here though, but not too bad. And the Ghent city is a very old city. In medieval times, we were the second largest city of Europe. And as you can see, we have a lot of beautiful buildings which are actually witness that. We also have a harbor, which makes the city very diverse. We have industry, we have history, and we have an old university which was founded in 1817 by the Dutch government, which was occupying our country at that time. Our hospital is a university hospital. It's one of the largest hospitals in Belgium, and we are actually offering almost every kind of surgery to our population. But what I would like to talk with you is, what do we do when patients bleed? And we do know this type of surgery sometimes happens. Luckily, not too often, but we are all aware that sometimes we are confronted with huge bleeding. However, we should not only focus on those cases, but also on cases where we have actually continuously blood loss, and without knowing it, we are actually bleeding the patient's hemoglobin. So what we do know from a long time is that when we do surgery, we actually create an oxygen depth inside the patient. And what we also know, and that's not unimportant, if this oxygen depth is relatively fast recovering, for example, within the first 8 hours, morbidity and mortality for our patients is extremely low. But as the time to recover is getting longer and longer, or it's not recovering at all, then we have an extremely high mortality. That means that in order to avoid that, we can actually work on 2 points. We can work on cardiac output, or we can work on hemoglobin. And of course, hemoglobin will be part of this talk. So if we want to use hemoglobin, the most easy way to do is just call the blood bank and ask for some packet red cells. And they have high concentrations of red blood cells, but we all know that there are quite some problems related to that. One of them is that we are actually aware of the fact that if you transfuse patients, compared to non-transfused patients, that we have a much higher mortality, and the mortality can extend up to 60 months after surgery. But of course, what is a common remark when you show these slides is, that's nice, but you're probably not comparing the right people, because maybe these people were less sick than those. So at the end of the day, you're not comparing the same population. But luckily for us, the same study made a distinction with very sick patients, NIHA class 4. And as you can see, you have exactly the same tendency. If you transfuse the patients, they are doing worse. So meaning transfusion, although we need it very often, it is also harmful for the patient. Why are those patients dying? Well, it's not only from cardiac reasons, but the same amount is actually dying for non-cardiac reasons. So meaning that the mechanism why people are suffering from blood transfusion is probably a quite complex mechanism. So if we want to avoid it, then we all learned, oh, let's go for hemodilution. Because if we hemodilute, then the patient's concentration of hemoglobin will be lower, so he will be losing less hemoglobin. However, what we have learned, if you hemodilute, the more you hemodilute, the worse is the outcome of the patient. So meaning also there we have to be careful. It can be a tool, but a tool that will not always work in an appropriate way. And finally, we could say, well, let's combine it. We first hemodilute, and then we actually retransfuse the patient in order to restore an initial and a good condition. But what we learn out of that is that if you have patients who had no hemodilution in blue, or they had no transfusion, then you see they have, of course, a certain percentage of complications. If you compare it to patients who were hemodiluted, you actually double the rate of complications. And if you go then to those who were transfused, again, you will increase the number of complications. But what is even more important, if you combine both, you have worst outcome. Meaning that the strategy in extensive hemodilution to start with and retransfusing afterwards is most likely not the best option for a patient. So if we want to recuperate and blood loss, then we have, of course, the different cell salvage machines on the market. And then the big question is there a difference? Yes, there's a white one, there is a blue one, there is another one. And you could say it's the same like this. Are they the same? Yes, they are both robots. But are they the same? Those who like Star Trek, they know they have completely different characters. And that's exactly the same with those machines. They have a different character because they have a different working mechanism. One of them is, or a group is using what they are calling discontinuous systems because you have several steps and in between you stop the machine every time. And the other one is what they call a continuous system. You have a spinning wheel, and in this spinning wheel, all these different actions are done at the same time. So is this an advantage? Is this a disadvantage? What can we expect from the different machines? That's what I would like to explain to you. And in order to understand that, I think we have to go back to some basic physics. If you have something, for example, a cell in a fluid, what we would like to do is we want to assemble all these cells over here so we can give a concentrated amount of cells back to the patient. And if you do that, then you have different forces. Force number one will be gravity, which is dragging this cell downwards. We have on the other way, if we do that, we will replace the fluid which is here upwards. So there is a counter-opposing force which will pull back this red cell upwards. And then, of course, we have the buoyancy, which depends on the density of this cell. That means that the terminal velocity will depend, and this is important, on viscosity, on radius, and of course on the velocity in here. So we can rearrange this, and if we rearrange this for sedimentation, then you get the important factors would be the density of the red blood cell, the plasma, the viscosity of the plasma, and the radius of the cell. If we do that in a very simple form, as you can see here, then what will happen is that the larger cells will go much faster than smaller cells, which makes sense. But this is unfortunately not the case what is happening inside blood. Because if you have blood, there is one big difference, and that one big difference is the protein content of the blood, and more specifically, the fibrinogen content. Because for those who remember their former courses, fibrinogen is the only protein which has a rod-like structure. So it's not a sphere, it's a rod-like structure. And that means it can make connections between cells, so we get this type of aggregates, or also known as rouleau formation. And now we get the situation that these larger aggregates are actually sedimenting, and at the same time, the fluid which is here has to pass some way all those cells. And if that happens, of course, this will reduce the velocity at which the cell can settle. Now, what is important, that is that if you do that in the beginning, you have a very rapid sedimentation, and the more the cells are actually coming together, it's slowing down. But a very important factor in this is time, and that's often forgotten. Time will actually depend on how well those cells are packed in this region. And we could put it in a different way. This is the same graph, and we could take, for example, the blue, the red, the yellow, and the green are different hematocrit levels. Then you can see in the beginning we have a rapid increase in hematocrit, but to go for the last part, that takes a lot more time because we have this sedimentation issue. So, so if we look to the different cells, then you will see that, of course, the hematocrit will play a role. It's to say that if you look here, this is 90%, this is 30% of hematocrit, and it takes much longer to obtain this 90% because the sedimentation velocity will be much lower. So let's start now with the bowl system. A bowl system has one limitation, and you will see there are the same limitations for a continuous system, and that limitation is that the rotations or the centrifugal force is fixed by a certain rotation number. Most of the time it's in the neighborhood of 5,600. A second important point is that you have this nose, which is actually going very deep in the packet red cells, meaning that the cells are already located at the wall where you have the highest force, centrifugal force available, which is then gradually decreasing as you go up this bowl. Meaning that also the packing, how far the cells are one from another, is actually decreasing as, increasing, sorry, as you go upwards to this bowl. What we also know is that in this bowl we can pack the cells for quite some thickness because we have space here and we can make a very nice layer of red blood cells. And we have about 250 square centimeters of total surface on which we can accumulate those cells. Now, if we are going to compare this with this, and you show that to a student, for example, in my hospital, they say, what's this? Because this is much more difficult to understand. There are all these different holes. It looks like a sort of a UFO. You don't know what it is. And in order to make it a little bit more, less complicated, you could say if this would be the center, this would have a lower gravity, and as we go more outwards, the gravity force will, the centrifugal force, sorry, will actually further increase. So the shed blood is going in here. Here we have the maximum force, and then we start washing, and then we go out. Now, there is some interesting point a lot of people do not notice, but if you look to the pathway, then you will see that the pathway for the shed blood is twice as long for the blood compared to the washing phase. And this has everything to do with the fact that the blood contains proteins, like I was explaining, and saline does not. That means, and you can see it very well here, now we have used a stroboscope, you can see there is a very small layer in the beginning, and as we actually transverse during this spinning wheel, the layer is getting thicker and thicker, and as you can see here, it's very dark because there is a very high accumulation of cells in this area. So I told you time is very important, so I made some calculations for you in such a spinning wheel, and that's what you actually see here. What you see is the different lines are different hematocrits, and in the beginning we have a rapid increase of the hematocrit, but as we progress over the length of the channel, it becomes more and more difficult to further increase this hematocrit. Again, time is an important aspect, but you have the benefit here that you maintain this centrifugal force during the whole procedure. Now, the interesting part is you remember that channel for washing the fluid is much shorter. And what you see here is the blood channel, and this is the washing channel. And you see immediately the difference. You go even faster to a high hematocrit because there is less hindered settling, there is less connections, and you have a much faster sedimentation in this region. And that's the reason why you actually have a shorter channel for washing. So let's go back to the bowl system. The bowl system is working slightly different, and we all know the principle. The blood is coming in, you actually start separating, plasma is removed, and at the end you have this very nice layer of red blood cells. But what is important, if you want to increase now the velocity in a bowl system, then we have to recall if you increase flow, you actually decrease the time for settling inside such a bowl. And that is known for a very long time. If we actually increase the filling rate, for example, then we will compare that to the hematocrit we can obtain. The lower will be the filling rate, the higher will be the hematocrit, and you can go up to extremely high values if you fill it extremely slow. But of course, we are in patients who are bleeding, and we are not always willing to go to a very low rate. But the price we pay as we increase this flow rate, we will get lower and lower hematocrit because the time necessary for sedimentation is decreased. And another important factor, if we are looking to massive blood loss, is, of course, one, how high is the hematocrit in the collected blood? If it's very low, then it will take much more time to fill such a bowl, also for another device like the continuous system. But if we, of course, increase the flow rate, then we can decrease again this time. So we have some ways in playing with the time necessary to fill the system and to process the blood. However, we have to keep in mind that if you do so, the blood is coming in here. If you increase the velocity, you will get some turbulence at this area, and you will get some turbulence here. So you can't increase it infinitely. You can't say, I'm going to do it at 2 liters a minute, because if you do that, then you will create this type of turbulence and spilling of cells at the top of such a bowl. So now let's look a little bit on what are then the important factors for processing. Well, I already explained you that the inlet hematocrit will play a role. If it's lower, it takes more time, so we need more time to achieve a given bowl. Of course, if it's higher, we need less time because it's easier to go from 20 to 60 than it is from 10 to 60. And another important factor will be the washing. The more you wash, the more time you need, depending on the filling speed of the washing solution in order to deliver it to the patient. And then the big question is, what does a continuous system do? Because that's not so easy then to calculate how much time has this system necessary to actually bring blood back to the patient. And there is several ways in doing this. This is the dummy way, that's my way. So I just looked at, okay, we have a certain time, we have a certain amount of cells. I look at the second point in time and I look to the increase in cells. Of course, like I said, that's the dummy way because I just believe then that all these numbers are exactly measured, which is not the case for any system, whether it is continuous or discontinuous. But nevertheless, for the sake of the discussion, we can make then some calculations. For example, if we had this 18 mLs from the previous slide, we would have about 117 mLs with a hematocrit of 75. In a bowl system, you would have about 120 if you had a 125 ml bowl at a hematocrit more or less of 55. And of course, if we use an urgent program based on these calculations, assumptions, we would have more or less 60 mLs a minute we will actually deliver towards a patient. But with a continuous system, we can go up as high as 100 mLs a minute. But if you ask that to people who actually use the different devices, a lot of them will tell you, well, okay, they are quite compatible, but I don't have the impression that one is faster than the other. So we were interested also because we had to make a decision some years ago whether we were staying with discontinuous system, whether we are going to combine discontinuous with continuous. So we actually did a test where we had bovine blood, we had it at a certain inlet hematocrit. We used different machines on the market. We used them in emergency setting and the standard emergency setting, so we were not playing ourselves. It was the standard from the company. And then we actually looked to the time necessary to process all that blood. Of course, we have to make two important comments. Comment number one is if you look to the continuous system, it needs about 1 minute to come up to speed. So we also included that in the time because it's only honest to do that. And what we excluded in this slide, but of course we have it in other parts of the study, it's the time at the end of the procedure when you are left, for example, with a partial bowl, where you have to reconcentrate and blood taking it out of the bag. But if you look to those conditions, which would then be compatible, then you can see there is almost no difference between those machines, meaning that every machine on the market has more or less the same capacity to return packet cells back to the patient. With one exception, in the beginning of the procedure, as you can see, the continuous system is slightly slower, and this has to do with the fact that it has to come up to its speed, which gives you a loss of 1 minute. But remember, once you're in the processing phase, this disadvantage falls away. So what's further available on the market? Well, there are some very interesting new studies. This is a study which is actually comparing the cardiac patients, the orthopedic patients, and they look to several programs. As you can see, dark gray would be the emergency program, this would be the standard program, and in white it would be an optimized program. And what is very interesting is that if you use an emergency program, no surprise, remember you are going to increase the flow. Increasing the flow is decreasing time for settling, so it means the hematocrit is always lower. And that makes sense. This is basic physics. But of course, what you gain is time. As you can see here, it's the fastest program in bringing the blood back to the patient. And that you will find both for cardiac patients and for orthopedic patients. So meaning we can go for speed, but then we pay a price on hematocrit. What about continuous, discontinuous? This is an old study, and it was not always performed, in my opinion, in the best possible way. But what you can see here, this is the returning of blood. So you find back that systems are returning in an emergency program relatively fast amounts of blood towards the patient. But what makes a big difference is that as the time component is less important in a continuous system, that the continuous system is the only system that can maintain hematocrit under whatever condition extremely high. Because there you don't have this huge impact of time on the sedimentation. What about elimination rates? Well, this is still, I think, a landmark study because it's one of the few studies which looked at a huge number of waste products. And as you can see, if you compare all these devices, there are almost no differences between them. They are all doing a very good job. So what about this washing efficiency? Well, we have to be a little bit cautious in that respect with the bowl system. Because the bowl system, how do we believe it works? The saline is coming in, and then due to this nose here, it's brought inside this packed cell, and then what we hope is that it's nicely going all over through these packed cells. But unfortunately, saline is like a human being. If I want to go to the pool, I'm not going to walk first around this building and go to the pool. I take the door straight to the pool. And that's exactly what saline is doing. It's not going nicely through this pack, it's actually going like this, and then it takes the way of the lowest resistance. Meaning, this has little impact as long as the bowl is completely filled. But if we have an incomplete filled bowl, like in this case, what will happen if the saline comes here? How can it wash this solution? Because there is no resistance for it to do that. And there has been, you can easily see this because you can make those calculations yourself. If you would have a hematocrit of 60 in a completely filled bowl, you would have about an elimination rate which will be around 95, even up to almost 100%. But if you decrease that to 40%, because it's only partially filled, for example, 40%, then you decrease this already to 60%. And if you have lower filled bowls, you can go as low as only 20% elimination. So I think the reasoning that you can give this back to a patient, we should be a little bit prudent by stating that, because it's unclear what is the impact of this waste product on the patient. So if we now look to partial bowl elimination, there are not a lot of studies which actually looked at this. This is also a relatively old study. And what you can see in blue is the inlet condition, so that's actually going inside the bowl. The low, medium, and full means a full bowl, completely filled, medium filled, or lowly filled. And it's no surprise if there is not a lot of blood in there that also the increase in hematocrit is almost nothing, because there is a huge part of fluid which still remains in that bowl. So there is an important part of hemodilution. And this, of course, gets better if you have, for example, a half-filled bowl, and it's optimal when the bowl is completely filled. Now, this author stated, you don't care, because actually, I believe this is good. And when I was first reading this paper, I was like, how do you explain that? Because I don't understand it from a physics standpoint, because this is actually what he showed. He said, you have a much lower free plasma hemoglobin if you actually have a partially filled bowl. And so this should be good for our patient. But this is complete in opposition to what the physics tells us. This is not possible. So I start looking to his methodology, and actually he expresses this as milligram per 100 milliliter or per deciliter, meaning that, of course, this value will be low, but what he is not mentioning, that in this bowl, there is only about 24% of cells, and all the rest is fluid, so there is much more fluid. Here you have 60 or 65% of hematocrit and only 35% of fluid, meaning that if you correct for that, you get a completely different picture, and then you will see that, of course, free plasma hemoglobin, because the volume is much higher if the bowl is not completely filled compared to a bowl which is completely filled. And that makes sense, and that's in complete agreement with the physics behind it. So what about those sets? Because that's another point of interest. We have normal sets where we have relatively large bore tubings, which makes sense because we want to give the blood back as soon as possible to our patient. And then when you see for the first time this continuous system, a lot of people say, wow, have you seen the bore size of that? It's like an infusion line. How do we have to use that in a case where we have massive blood loss of a patient? And of course, this is a very good observation. But the observation does not take into account the different working mechanisms. Meaning that if you work in a discontinuous system, you have 3 different steps. And that means you have to do in less time the same thing you have to do here over a longer time period. That means if you empty or you fill a bowl under immersion conditions, some of the machines even go up to 800 mLs a minute, meaning you need for that large bore tubing. But as this system is continuous, the maximum flow you can achieve, but continuously, remember that word, is only 100 mLs a minute. And now we can make the math. We can look to, for example, if there is turbulence. No, both of them are almost laminar. Is there a high pressure gradient? No, they are quite compatible. And is there a high shear causing hemolysis? No, they are quite compatible. And the reason is that one actually has to do it in a very short time period, so you need very high flows, and the other is doing it in a continuous way, so there is more time to do the same work. So another point, and I think that's often forgotten, and we are getting more and more concerned about that, it's fat. And why are we interested in fat? Because it's clear more today than it was before that not only cardiac patients, but also orthopedic patients who have neurological problems, very often this is related to fat. And David Stump at the time did great work on it. And what I like to show is one of his slides where he actually showed fat in the microcirculation. And the interesting part is, you will see the fat particles coming, that it will finally block the flow, as you will see now, and it will reverse the flow. But what's even more important is what you see, the gray debris between those fat particles, what you see here. Because this is actually the glycocalyx, which is the internal part of the blood vessel, which is completely scraped out of this vessel. Meaning that you have a severe damage of the vessel, which is measurable when you do, for example, videoscopy of a patient's tongue, but you will also see it because the blood-brain barrier will be completely disrupted. Now, if we look to a continuous system, how do you get rid of fat? You get rid of fat because you lock it. It has a lower density than the other elements, so you will lock it as long as the wheel remains spinning, which normally is the whole procedure. Does it mean that those systems are superior in removing fat? No, and that's a mistake. Some people say it's superior. No, it depends on how you work with a discontinuous system. So if we look to a discontinuous system, what is the problem there? We stop it from time to time, because that's a part of the working principle. And if you do that, then of course, all the fat which was locked somewhere in this bowl is remixed in this bowl and can be given back to the patient. So then the big question is, where is it locked inside the bowl? Well, when you look in a bowl, it's lighter, so it will be here and maybe also there. So that means if I want to remove fat, and just keep thinking with me, how should we do that? Well, we should actually increase flow so we can flush it through and then we can remove it. And that's exactly what some of the new programs are doing. They actually, as you can see here, these were older discontinuous systems. And in that time, indeed, it was true that the continuous system was superior to all of them. But nowadays, you can see, for example, in this case, we have also discontinuous systems which are as effective. The question then is, if this is true, is there still a difference? Yes, there is a difference, because you always pay a price in life. If you improve something, sometimes it's at the expense of something else. And in order to show you that, I will show you the working mechanism of those new programs. What you see here is what they changed. This is the WASH program, and for example, you see here for 125 bowl, they actually increased the flow from 250 up to 750. So they actually triple the flow, which makes sense. You want to flush it, out of this position and bring it to a position where you can actually remove it. The second point, of course, if you increase that, you also will have to increase the volume. So you need more volume because you have a higher flow by which you do that. And finally, what you will have to do is then bring back the flow because you need time for sedimentation. If you don't do that, remember, high flows, they will flush out also cells, and the expense would be a lower hematocrit. And that's exactly what was also shown in studies who actually looked at this fat removal in discontinuous systems. In this study, which is a rather recent study, as you can see, from 2016, it was a very nice performed study, and they found finally a hematocrit of 48% with this optimized program for fat removal. However, if you compare this to a continuous system, because it maintains the time factor, will remain at a hematocrit of at least 65%. So what can we conclude? Well, I believe that today we made some massive progress in both continuous and discontinuous systems. And both systems have excellent red blood cell recovery rates. I think a continuous system is less sensitive to change in working conditions. Why? Because it actually offers this continuous centrifugal field which is not disrupted during the procedure. They can both remove fat in an efficient way, but remember, they do it in a different way, and there is a price to pay if you want to remove all the fat. And then finally, what was probably a subjective factor, and we can discuss that, but for us it was very important. We are a relatively large institution. Before, we had a huge inventory of different size of bowls, pediatrics, big ones for trauma. We had to make choices also on what is now the best possible bowl, because we got a phone call, there is a trauma coming in, but very often this information is incomplete. Is this a child? Is this a small woman? Or is it a huge, tall guy who had a huge blood volume? But also the opposite is true. Sometimes you get those patients, well, he's still a little bit bleeding. He's coming back to the OR. And then he's coming back and it's a venous bleed they can't control. And at the end, he's losing 10 liters and you only had 125. So you're pushing that 125 in increasing flows. And at the end, you can sometimes say, what am I doing, for God's sake, with this type of bowl? I should have gone for a bigger one. That's one of the big advantages for this continuous system. One disposable, which you can use for a baby of 2 kilograms up to an adult of 120 kilograms. But finally, and that's my final message for all of you, in this room there is a lot of intellectual capacity. And I'm very glad that I may present for you, because I know a lot of you know probably even more than I do from these devices. But we should be very careful, because very intelligent people, and I think no one will dispute that he was a very intelligent person, if we start doing things over and over again, and we believe that just by doing things the same way we can improve outcome, that's a mistake. He called it insanity. I wouldn't be so strong in my words, but I think we should reconsider our techniques on a continuous basis. Thank you very much for your attention.